I hope everybody can hear me, and welcome to this joint session which is between Norwegian People's Aid and the Conflict and Environment Observatory. So we've now just got short of an hour, unfortunately, to cover the topic of environmental assessment in humanitarian mine action and discuss the tool which is being developed by MPA to support this process. So hopefully my slides move on now. Could everyone see that next one? So it's just a two-women show today. So just introduce myself. I'm Lindsay Cottrell from the Conflict and Environment Observatory, and I'm joined by Kendra Dupuy from MPA, who's a senior advisor on environment. And together, CEOBS and MPA are working on a joint project on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict. And this is just one of the number of different work streams that we have with respect to that project, and this specifically, which is looking at mainstreaming environmental safeguarding in mine action. So do feel free, obviously, to use the chat function. Everyone's very familiar with all this. We are going to leave questions to the end. And hopefully we'll have time to cover some of those. So do bank them up. And if we don't have time, then hopefully we'll be able to answer those through email if we run out. Our aim today then is to give some guidance on how to build and use environmental assessment tools. And so just run through the agenda, a quick introduction about what environmental assessment is, why we do it, and what are the general steps. Then hopefully I'm going to run a quick poll to understand what's the state, what's happening across different organisations. Then we're going to run through the status of environmental assessment in mine action and refer back to the UNMAS standard. We're going to discuss the tool that MPA are developing, discuss the logistics and when to do it, who should be doing it, the aims of the assessment. And then we're going to have a look at some of the available data sources, some of the other tools that are out there and resources, and then hopefully wrap up with some Q&A. So on this slide, we've just thrown together just some of the questions that hopefully we'll be answering today. What's the assessment, when to do it, as I said before, the standards, who should be doing it, how it's done, and what you're going to do with the information once it's gathered. So what is environmental assessment? So there's quite a number of different definitions kicking around, and they do vary slightly. Overall, though, environmental assessment aims to establish the impacts from an activity or a project. So this could be a positive or a negative impact. An environmental assessment is similar to the requirements of other risk assessments or health and safety or even financial risk assessment. The parameters are just different, but the process remains the same. So it is a systematic process and an iterative, sorry, I can't speak, and it may need to be revisited. It needs to be carried out as early as possible, and it's aiming to identify change and impact and to look at what needs to be mitigated or hopefully avoided or prevented in the first place. So some of the key stages then. The first stage is identifying what the baseline is. So what is the environment? What are the local environs where you're operating? What's the location? What's the existing conditions? Is it an urban setting? Is it a rural setting? Are there protected areas with biodiversity, important species? Are you nearby watercourses? Are there cultural property assets that you need to be worried about? And then the next stage, obviously, is looking at your activities and determining whether there's any existing mitigation which is already in place. And then looking at the significance of any residual effects. And this will depend on the sensitivity of the baseline in the environment that you're working in, the mitigation which is in place, and obviously the scale of the impact. So as in health and safety, environmental mitigation is the way that adverse effects can be avoided or reduced. And this is either by design or adaptation, or it can be by other measures where the impacts themselves cannot be avoided. And in some measures that are designed to mitigate an adverse impact may leave the environment actually improved over its existing state. And in these cases, the residual impact will be positive or benefit. So the two examples I've got here relate to munition disposal, for example. So you may choose to use an alternative if that's an option to open burning and open detonation. But where open burning and open detonation can't be avoided, you may be looking at other measures, for example, optimizing the location of that open burning site, or undertaking under optimum environmental weather conditions. And then on top of that, there's enhancement. So this might be a measure that's carried out to actually improve the environment over its existing state. And in some cases, it might be necessary to do a combination of both design and other measures. So when you're assessing the significance of an environmental assessment, I'm sure this is familiar with many people. It's quite a common matrix to be used in risk assessment. So where you're looking at the residual effect, it's a factor of the severity or the magnitude of the impact multiplied by the likelihood of its occurrence, and you'll get a residual risk. So why is environmental assessment important? Well, no surprise, there's a host of reasons that I have listed here. Mine action and disarmament activities can cause a negative impact on the environment, whether this is through air, water, or potential soil contamination if it's not carried out appropriately, through vegetation removal, etc. Where you're operating, there may be certain legal requirements in the country or the region that you're working in. Following the principles of the humanitarian do no harm principle, the overall duty to make life better for people, and that includes the ecosystems in these affected areas. Also, organisations looking to actually minimise their contribution to climate change and where they can reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. Looking to comply with good practice like the UNMAS standard on environmental management. And then there's the reputational aspects as well. And remembering that with respect to environmental stewardship, this involves everybody, and it's not necessarily the responsibility of one individual who's got the umbrella of environment or the badge of environment. And also it adds value and it supports any environmental reporting requirements that you may have to donors, for example. So the key steps, as I've kind of mentioned already, firstly, understanding what the baseline in the existing environment is, establishing what local and national regulatory policy may be, review activities and aspects of their impacts, and then identify measures to mitigate the adverse effects. Then they'll be predicting any residual effects and determining whether any more needs to be done. And then finally, from that, you may develop a commitment register of environmental actions that are needed. So on this slide, what I've just tried to point out is what is the kind of overall aims of what we're trying to do and what we don't expect it to be. So it's got to be straightforward to use an environmental assessment tool. It needs to inform and support decisions. It needs to be easy to adapt, and hopefully it will facilitate behavioural change. It's not meant to be a one-step process. Recognise that it won't necessarily be perfect. It may need adapting over time, and there may be data gaps. You might not have all the environmental information to inform those decisions, and it won't always be relevant to all aspects of work. So hopefully I am going to be able to ask you to take part in a poll now, if I can get this to work, seeing as we've had some other issues. So hopefully, if everyone goes to the tab on the right-hand side, I shall be able to share the first poll question. Let me just find it. So hopefully you can see that first question. And by clicking on there's 4 responses, hopefully you can click on to answer. I can't see any results yet, so I'm not very confident this is actually working. No, I don't think I'm seeing anything. Let's see.
Someone in the chat says they're unable to see the poll, only the PowerPoint.
Ah.
There are results in the poll. Oh boy, results are there. Oh, okay.
Right. Sorry, we'll ditch this. It's not working. What we could do, I think it would be really interesting if people are happy to participate. We could actually email around this poll to gauge an understanding of what's actually happening across different organisations. So I shall move swiftly on. So I apologise about that, and I shall pass on to the next slide and hand over to Kendra.
Great, you can hear me and see me, I trust. My name is Kendra Dupuy, and I work at Norwegian People's Aid as a senior advisor on environment, collaborating with Lindsay on environmental mainstreaming in mine action. And just moving forward here, so I first want to say that right now at NPA, I've been developing an environmental assessment tool for use in the mine action and disarmament sector, which will hopefully be launched this coming month in June. And we will hopefully be able to receive feedback from the mine action sector on it. But just to walk you through what you can expect to see in the tools, and also why those components are there. Let me first of all say, what are the standard and what are the expectations in mine action for doing environmental assessments? Well, we do have an environmental management standard within UNMAS. This is 7.13, which says that mine action authorities, NMAA, shall identify and assess environmental aspects and identify measures to mitigate those adverse aspects. The NMAA, the authorities, can determine if an environmental impact assessment is necessary. And mine action operators shall conduct their operations according to what has been determined by the EIA. Now, Annex D of that standard provides guidelines for the EIA and defines what an EIA is, which is often a legal requirement. We're not using that term here, but just to flag it for everyone. This is the process of identifying, predicting, evaluating, and mitigating various environmental impacts prior and during operations. Okay, Lindsay, next. So we have a couple of questions I think probably would be useful to have answers to. And first of all is, and Lindsay's answered a bit of it, but when should we carry out environmental assessment? And there are a few answers to this. And the first is, of course, if there is a legal obligation to do so. And that's what the UNMAS standard tells us. We should also do environmental assessment whenever mine action operations take place in protected or sensitive environmental areas. When there is uncertainty about the scale or significance of impact, again, these two requirements from UNMAS. And some other suggested guidance, again, echoing Lindsay, that we should consider doing assessment prior to commencing operations. But we should also assess continually as much as is possible within our resource constraints, and monitor our impacts as well as the effects of mitigation measures during and after operations. Some other points at which we may consider assessing is when there has been a major change in operational methodology, staff, if there's been a weather event, a seasonal change, perhaps there's been a change in regulations or stakeholders, or new risks have emerged. For instance, perhaps a new refugee camp has been sited nearby, or a major business. So anytime a major change has happened would be a good time to do an assessment. Okay, Lindsay. Now, who should do an environmental assessment? So within the UNMAS standard, the roles are a little bit unclear, but the standard does say that the national mine action authorities shall identify, assess, and document environmental aspects of mine action activities, and that the authorities may require an EIA to be conducted and ensure that it is. Now, what is the responsibility of mine action operators? Well, they must ensure that the environment is protected and that environmental protection is a factor in the planning and conduct of all mine action operations. And they must conduct their operations according to what comes out of the EIA, should that be conducted. Okay. So there are some steps going back to Lindsay's earlier slides and thinking about having a systematic approach. And this is what you can expect to see in the tool that will be launched next month. So we first want to identify and understand the policy and the regulatory context, so we know what we need to comply with in terms of regulations. We need to identify and understand who the relevant stakeholders are. And for each of these, I'll go into some more details so that you can understand better what we mean by each of these. We also need to identify our own internal procedures, policies, and processes. We need to know about the environmental profile of the area in which we're operating. We need to identify potential environmental impacts and determine which of those are likely to be negative. And we need to identify mitigation measures for those negative impacts. Last, we need to monitor and report on our implementation and progress. Okay. Okay, what do we mean by understanding the policy and regulatory context? So this would be gathering information about what the relevant and current national or potentially subnational, depending on what kind of country you're operating in, regulations, so laws and policies on environment and on climate change. Increasingly, a lot of countries are adopting climate change regulations that may pertain to mine action. And there are also national mine action standards that pertain to environmental management. And these type of standards include things like standards on waste management, siting of temporary facilities and site preparation, data collection on environmental variables, so basic environmental data collection, vegetation removal, and transportation of explosives material. When we talk about identifying the stakeholders, the relevant stakeholders, what do we mean by this? So according to the UNMAS standard on environmental management, mine action operators should understand the environmental needs and expectations of mine action stakeholders. And a good first step here would be to identify who the relevant stakeholders are for environmental issues. This may include members of local communities, and that may further include people who use or own or control particular natural resources or know about environmental issues. It probably should also include government authorities, and perhaps even other nonprofits or NGOs, companies, and maybe even other mine action operators. Identifying and understanding their needs and expectations regarding environmental management of mine action and disarmament operations is a key part of this exercise. Okay, step 3 is looking at, and speaking from an operator's standpoint, what are our internal procedures, policies, and processes regarding environmental management? So first of all, the UNMAS standard on environmental management does lay out some requirements, particularly for the national authorities and for operators. And the first is that both the national authorities and the operators should have an environmental policy. NPA has just adopted one, and it is on our website if anybody wants to look at an example. Mine action operators and the national authorities should also have a standard operating procedure on environmental management and or incorporate environmental management aspects into existing SOPs, thinking back to the areas I talked about earlier on national mine action standards, things like waste management and so on. The UNMAS standard also calls for operators and the national authorities to have an environmental management system in place, and happy to provide guidance on that if people have questions about what is in an EMS. And there may be other relevant internal documents that you need to pull together to guide environmental assessment. Okay, step 4 would be assessing the environmental profile of the area, gathering data on a variety of questions. So first of all, understanding if the location in which you're operating is perhaps considered to be an environmentally sensitive or protected area, in which case additional measures may need to be taken to ensure that there is not damage to those sensitive or protected areas and resources. A good understanding of the various types of wildlife in the location, so flora and fauna. Speaking to the next point, vegetation type and density. Understanding the soil conditions in which you're operating, where water is sourced from and where and how it drains, and whether there are significant historical and cultural sites and artifacts which are supposed to be protected. And finally, collecting information about whether there have been recent severe weather and extreme environmental effects, of which we do have recent examples and do affect mine action operations. Okay, what are some areas of potential environmental impact that we could think about? And in the tool that we'll launch, there are more detailed questions about the source of these types of impacts. So, and the UNMAS standard helps us out here as well, identifying these potential areas. And the first one is emissions to air. And this could include driving vehicles or from machines. Releases to water. We want to ensure that we don't pollute our water sources. Other types of releases to land, so perhaps toxic waste leaking into the soil. Of course, soil degradation. We also need to think about how we are impacting on vegetation, for instance, through cutting and removal. How might we impact on wildlife? How might we impact cultural heritage and history? And what are we doing with waste and how are we managing that waste? Okay, now having thought through and identified those kind of broad areas, let's think about how we can mitigate the negative impacts across those areas. So thankfully, again, the UNMAS standard Annex C provides a long bit of guidance for us on protection and mitigation measures against adverse environmental impacts. I encourage everyone to read it. It's really excellent. And Annex E of the standard also provides a very helpful environmental management checklist, which again, I encourage people to look at. A bit of advice is that mitigation measures must, of course, given that we do have the standard, we also need to tailor those mitigation measures to the local context, including the regulatory requirements, and also ensure that the mitigation measures don't cause harm. And going back to one of the early slides in this presentation that Lindsay showed us, a heat map of our risks, risk assessments. So here we want to, when we prioritize which mitigation measures, or when we prioritize mitigation measures, we need to do that based on a risk management approach, thinking about the probability that the adverse impact will occur and the likely severity of that impact, and then prioritize those that have both high probability and high likely severity.
Thank you, Kendra.
Yep.
So back to me now. And what I wanted to demonstrate is some of the available data sources and give some examples of the open source environmental data sets that are out there. So remember, to input into the environmental assessment, obviously you need environmental data, and it's looking at both how the existing environment might affect mine action and also how mine action might affect the environment itself. So the one I wanted to show today, one example is EarthMap, which gives a lot of primary data, for example, on surface water features, forest data, information on areas that are maybe in decline. And it's quite a powerful tool. It enables quite complex analysis of data, and it's based on Earth observation, environmental and climate data. So big fingers crossed now, because I hope this is going to work. So hopefully you can see the map showing now. And what I'm going to give an example of, so I'm live on the tool now, and I'm going to focus in on Vietnam. Then it lets you, once you've selected a country, it lets you look at different boundary levels. And in this instance, I'm going to home in on provinces. I'm going to look at Quang Tri. So focus, zoom in there. And I'm interested in looking at climate data. So we're going to have a look at the annual rainfall. So this, any information about the layer, you can just click to find out a bit more detail about it. So this is giving 40-year annual rainfall data. So I've clicked that layer, and now it's come up to show that, as you can see from the legend, within Quang Tri province, you've got the dark blue is showing a high increase in annual rainfall over the last 40 years. So if we drill down to that data a little bit more, I can select precipitation here, annual rainfall, and process. And it's come up with a nice graph here that shows from 1981, where you had an average rainfall of around about 2,200 millimeters per year, and that's increased to 2,700 millimeters per year by 2019. So that's a 27% increase in annual rainfall, which of course for mine action and for any, with respect to any issues, the potential for that to lead to an increase in flooding risk. So now we're going to have a look at another layer. So in this case, I'm going to go to water, and we can see surface water occurrence change intensity. And if I click on that layer and home in, so the legend here is showing, so the dark red is decreases in surface water occurrence, and the dark green showing an increase in surface water occurrence over the last 40 years. So you'd be able to use it to highlight potential areas which may be at increased risk of flooding based on historical data. So the next one I'd like to just show is, this time I'm going to go to Cambodia. Again, we're going to go on the province level. And this time I'm going to home in on the northern border between Thailand and Cambodia. And now I'm going to select forestry. And we're going to look at tree cover loss and gain. And this is over, again, you can just click the information tab. And this is from year 2000 to 2020. So just warn you, this is actually quite depressing. I'll click on that tab. Hopefully it'll come up in a second. So as you can see again from the legend, whoops, the red is showing tree cover loss between 2000 and 2020. You can see the severe impact in this region from deforestation. Again, we can analyze the data a bit further. So if I click on there, again, select forestry change. Taking a little while for this one to come up. And hopefully, I'm not sure you can read that from here, but what it's saying is that for that region, the area loss of tree cover is 191,000 hectares, which accounts to over 50% of total tree cover loss. So in terms of mine action, obviously that's got two implications. You may be thinking, well, if we're operating in an area where there's already a lot of deforestation, a little bit of mine action might not make much difference. But of course, that could contribute to an increase in the risk of landslide because of vegetation loss. So if you're working in an area where there's slopes or mountainous region, that could be an issue. Or you could also say, well, being as the area suffered so badly in deforestation in the last couple of decades, then there's need for extra diligence while mine action for post-clearance works, and the need maybe to consider thinking about the options for compensatory planting, maybe working with another local NGO to get that implemented. So one final one I'd just like to show you on Earth map. So this time I'm going to go to Iraq. And again, we can home in on a region. And this time I'm going to have a look at Basra in the south. And you can change it to satellite if you want to. Let's do that. And oh yeah, what I wanted to say as well, so I've been zooming in on a region and a boundary, but it does allow you to choose to draw a polygon, or you can upload a shapefile as well onto this if you wanted to. So I was going to show you fire data for this region of Iraq, and click on the frequency of fires. So in Iraq, it's fairly common practice to undertake arable burning with respect to arable lands to clear land, and it can be carried out, although that's not best practice with respect to UNMAS, with respect to clearing areas of vegetation. But this will give you an idea of frequency of fires within the area you might be working. So it might not be a very good idea to undertake clearance work in an area where there's active fires carrying out, or if if it's a must, which wouldn't want to recommend, of using burning for removing vegetation, looking at timing as well, because you'd have a cumulative effect if there's multiple burning carried out because of mine clearance and arable clearance, for example. So that is just what I wanted to show you on that one. And I switch back now to go back to the slides. And I just have to move on a bit because I had some backup slides in case that didn't work. So I just wanted to encourage everybody to have a look on that website and have a play at the data. There are tutorials there which I think are really helpful as well. There's one which is pretty good there on climate change. And as I mentioned before, you don't just have to home in on a region, you can upload polygons as well. So the next one I wanted to just talk about as well is another data set, which is Global Forest Watch. So this is similar to EarthMap. It provides information on forest data, but also on protected areas. It looks at forest integrity. There's also information there on indigenous lands, but that's only for selected countries. Information on mining and extraction processes, which might be important in certain areas, and also on deforestation rates. One thing to point out with the EarthMap data, for example, if you're looking at deforestation rates, forest loss, it can't distinguish between, it doesn't distinguish between natural forest and tree plantations, so it might not necessarily see deforestation if it's been replanted with a monoculture, say oil palm plantations. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and the forest data does provide information on protected areas, but it's just important to note that it's the importance of consulting with the relevant regional authorities about protected areas, but also that large areas of even the most important places in the world for species and habitats do remain unprotected, and they are at risk, and they're not legally recognised as ecologically important. So just because an area is not designated, it doesn't mean that it's not ecologically important. So globally, there's approximately 20 million square kilometres of key biodiversity areas. And these have been identified by a programme supported by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And less than 20% of those critically important. So these are the most important biodiversity areas, are actually protected by protected area status. So that's obviously, there's a huge areas that have still no protection at all. So it just re-emphasises the importance of considering the potential ecological importance of where operations are taking place. So the other one I wanted to mention is IBAT, which is the Integrated Biodiversity Tool. Again, there's a link here. A bit of caution as well, because some appear on the Global Forest Watch site and some don't appear on IBAT, so vice versa. So it's quite useful to flick between the two, so you can just check that the data is properly covered. This allows you to set up an account as well if you went into here, and you can list projects. So it's a very, very great website actually. And then, so from IBAT, this is just a screenshot. I wasn't going to dive into online for this. And this is a screenshot of the protected areas, designated areas on a national and regional level for Bosnia and Herzegovina. So if you again go in and have a play on this, you'll find that once you've made your selection, it will then, if you click on these, and then it will give you more information about why they've been designated and at what level. Over to you, Kendra.
Great. So let me just say a few concluding words here. We're aiming towards the conclusion here. So just a reminder, in terms of the various types of tools available to mine action operators and authorities, NPA myself working on a tool for the mine action sector. You'll hear more about it. Hopefully it will come out in June, technology permitting. But there are a number of other tools within the humanitarian sector that you may want to refer to, or perhaps even use parts of. So there is, first of all, what's called the NEAT tool, and this has been developed by the joint OCHA UNEP Office for Humanitarian Operations. There is also something called the CRS Stewardship Tool. There is the Flash Environmental Assessment Tool. FAO has EIA guidance for field projects. USAID has some very good guidance on doing EIAs, or environmental assessment broadly speaking, for projects. And there are many other sites, and there's some here that Lindsay has put into the chat, including from Swedish SIDA. So environmental assessment is not unique to mine action or to the humanitarian sector. It is a common practice across many sectors. So there is a lot of guidance out there. So you are not alone in this sense. Yep.
Thanks, Kendra. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on, again, some other kind of environmental assessment guidance and reporting. Kendra's already mentioned the CEDA one, which has been going for a while. They've been quite progressive with respect to what they provide. I think it's since about 2011 they've had a help desk on environment and climate change. And if you do, I have shoved it in the chat box, so you can have a look at the green toolbox that they've got on their website, and that does include a simplified environmental impact assessment tool as well. Also, I was just going to mention about the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. They have got a generic code of conduct for its delivery partners, which includes a set of KPIs, including the environment. The environmental, it's a little bit vague with the guidance for that as to what is expected with respect to environmental commitments, and it says that may be demonstrated by either a policy or by performance reporting or by membership of some kind of relevant code of conduct. But what it does say is about looking to include environmental risk registers as part of that reporting process, and obviously environmental assessment feeds into that kind of idea of an environmental risk register. And the last one I wanted to mention is about the 8+3 harmonised reporting, and I'm sorry if everyone all knows about this, but this was new to me, and it was brought to my attention by an MS student, one of our MSc students at Strathclyde University. So thank you very much to Morgan Hutchinson, and in her extended project for us, and she mentioned about the harmonised reporting, which has come out. This was way back in the 2016 World Summit, Humanitarian Summit, and it looks to, and that summit highlighted the importance of simplifying the reporting process for humanitarian reporting. An initiative led by Germany, Canada and Netherlands, I think it was, and the US are also in there, of asking for this simplified approach. Again, I've put the link there to that reporting in the chat. And it asks for, there's 8 core questions, and there's 3 additional questions, one of which is in the environment. And as part of that, it's asked for looking at the environmental impacts, but also the positive environmental impacts as well. So that might include any of the environmental enhancement work that could be done as well with respect to post-clearance. Over to you, Kendra.
Great. So just last 2 slides here to conclude. So what is the point of all this? How do we use the information we generate when we carry out an environmental assessment? So first of all, we want to make sure we keep our assessments updated. So keeping that data current and updated. And then we want to also, when we keep our data updated, we want to be able to monitor and report on our implemented measures and to be able to assess whether we were able to successfully mitigate, especially the identified negative impacts and/or enhance the positive ones. It's also useful to record new and emerging issues, as well as its incidents and accidents that are environmental in nature and the responses to them. From this data, we can learn, quote unquote, what works and try to adopt those measures across other sites. And finally, collecting systematically data on environmental impacts and mitigation measures provides us with important evidence of impact for stakeholders, perhaps donors or other funders, of our reduced environmental footprint and our ability to uphold our climate and environment responsibilities. Yep, so what to walk away from this session with? We have 10 key summary points for you. So first of all, remember that environmental assessment is a systematic approach that allows you or your organization to demonstrate your environmental performance to donors and other stakeholders. When we do assessment, we want to be sure we focus attention on key environmental issues, that we check and use relevant, current, and high-quality environmental data sources, that we have a risk management approach to assessment and to mitigation. Let's remember that environmental assessment is not just applicable to survey, clearance, and disposal, but it's also applicable to the offices that we have, our field camps, and other types of operational sites. We want to undertake environmental assessment early in mine action, but it's also a repetitive or repeated process, and we should revisit our data and our results. The point is to focus on improvement over time and to feed into environmental reporting. And ultimately, the big outcome here is to remember that we have collective responsibility for good environmental stewardship. So with that, we'll say thank you very much. Apologies for the technical difficulties in the beginning, but thankfully we figured them out. Lindsay, shall we open up for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been kind of looking down. I did think there was going to be a Q&A function, but obviously that doesn't happen with the side events. So if anyone wants to post any questions in the chat, alternatively, if you would like to get in contact by email, Kendra and I would be more than happy to answer those.
Indeed, and our emails, Lindsay, if you switch to the last slide, did we have them? You can find out where to find us. We are on email. Please reach out, get in touch anytime. We'd love to hear from you, to know your experience and/or your questions and need for guidance.
Yeah, and on another note as well, we have, and I think there may be some people who are already part of it. We've got a informal working group on environmental issues and mine action, which we haven't met yet this year, which is just been delayed getting it together. But if you are interested in joining that informal working group where we try and meet virtually and have kind of a rolling chair position for that, please also do get in touch. And there's also a LinkedIn group for that.
We have a listserv which we send out information on. Great. We do have a question here. Lindsay, do you want to tackle that? And I'll put the LinkedIn link in there. Which countries are giving best examples, or which countries are giving examples of best environmental management practices in mine action and why? Ooh, this is a PhD thesis. No, I'm kidding.
Well, the first one that springs to mind is the example of Colombia, because obviously they're operating in a very sensitive environment with respect to biodiversity. And FSD have done a lot of work with the Mine Action Authority there on developing a toolbox and guidance for mine action. Although, as far as I know, there was a draft National Mine Action Standard, and it was due to be published, and I think that was meant to be last year, but it hasn't happened for whatever reasons. But again, the drafts that we've seen of that were, yeah, very good. And that's also reflected in how obviously mine action operators work within Columbia as well.
Other questions?
You have to be a quick typer, I think.
Yeah, I suppose so. Well, again, just to remind people to get in touch, we can share the copy of the presentation. The tool for environmental assessment in Mine Action will be coming out soon. And just to get in touch with any questions or guidance, or if you have good examples yourself, we would really love to hear from you.
Yeah, and also we will write up an article about this as well to summarize some of the key points, as well as sharing the slides. If you're interested, get in touch. And also, if I work out how to see the poll results, I will share that as well as another technical glitch. So,
we have a question here about how the tool will be shared, and I'm investigating some different options, but in a way so that it is publicly accessible to everyone, perhaps on multiple sites. Yes, so it will be available publicly and free and all of that. So yes, in a way you'll be able to find it.
Great, thank you. And if we have no more questions, I suppose we can call it a day. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Great, thanks
for joining
a lot.
us today.
Great, and thanks to our support from the as well. If you're still out there, thank you.
Oh yeah.
Great. Ooh, not sure about the recording. I assume the answer is yes. Well, I'll follow up on that. Yeah. Lindsay, do you remember, is the recording? Ooh, where's the balance between efficiency of clear? Ooh, that's a tough question. Where's the balance between efficiency and clearance operations and environmental considerations? Oh.
Well, that's always to do. There's always a need for balance, and the environmental assessment is part of that process to understand what is the risk associated with what you're trying to mitigate, and whether that's a requirement. But you need to do that environmental assessment to understand whether that's what is appropriate and what is acceptable.
Okay, I think no more questions, and it looks like we're at time and losing people rapidly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Thanks,
okay. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.